Hi, my name is Galen Davis, and I'm a member of the Teen Advisory Board with Howard County Library System. Today, I'm going to be going through an introduction into absolute value. We're going to be specifically looking at the definition of absolute value, as well as absolute value equations with a few examples to go along. Now, let's get into the video. Okay, we're going to be going over the definition of absolute value. So what absolute value means is the distance. So the distance a number is from 0. So absolute value is always written as two lines on either side of a number. So we can show an example here of the absolute value of 2. So this is known as the absolute value of 2. So let's represent this on the number line. So we have our number line here, including 0, 1, 2, 3, -1, -2, -3. So let's plot the point 2 on the number, or absolute value of 2 on the number line. So how we have to measure this is we have to measure the distance 2 is from 0. So as we can see, we have the distance from 2 to 0 is 2. So what that means is that the absolute value of 2 is equal to 2. Now let's show another example. So let's find the absolute value of -2. So this is the absolute value of -2. So here, we can also plot this point, and we can measure the distance from 0. So although it is negative, we can now see that that -2 is 2 points away from 0. So we can say that the absolute value of -2 is equal to 2. So what this ends up showing is that the absolute value of a number will always be positive. So absolute value will always be positive. Make sure you understand that, everybody. Now, let's move on to a few examples. We're going to focus on the left side of the page first before we move on to the right. This is a good time to pause and go over the problems yourself, and then we can go over it together. All right, so for number 1, we're going to find the absolute value of x when x is equal to 5. So we can put the 5 in between the absolute value bars as we're plugging in x equals 5 into the absolute value of x. As this is 5 spaces from the point 0, we can say this is equal to 5. Now for number 2, we'll do the same thing, and we're going to be finding the absolute value of -9. So as we said before, this is 9 spaces from the value 0, and although it is negative within the absolute value bars, the answer will be positive. So the answer is 9. For the last example, we can plug it in the same way. And as we just did before, we are 5.5 spaces away from the value 0, and this will be 5/2. And that's it for the left side. Now is another good time to pause and work on the right side of the examples, and we can go up over it together. So for this side, number 1, we're deciding which value is greater. Let's first find what each absolute value is equal to, and then we can decide which is greater. So the absolute value of 5 is, as we stated before, equal to 5. the absolute value of 3 is equal to 3, as it is 3 spaces from the value 0. In this case, 5 is greater than 3, so the absolute value of 5 is greater than the absolute value of 3. For number 2, we can do the same thing. We'll find the absolute value of 6, which is 6 spaces from 0, so it is also 6. And then negative 7, which is 7 spaces from 0, so the answer is 7. And in this case, 7 is greater than 6, so the absolute value of negative 7 is greater than the absolute value of 6. So even though the absolute value of negative 7 is negative, it will be greater than 6 because 7 is greater than 6. Now let's do this final example. So the absolute value of 3 halves is equal to 3 halves, as it is 3.5 spaces away from 0. Negative 3 halves is also 3.5 spaces from 0, so it is 3.5. In this case, neither one is greater, as they are both equal to 3 halves, so 3 halves is equal to 3 halves. Or the absolute value of 3 halves is equal to the absolute value of negative 3 halves. So this is a good thing to remember, that the absolute value of the positive number and its also negative number will be equivalent. All right, so let's take this to the next level and expand into absolute value equations. These are a little bit more challenging than we did before, as we're going to be including some variables. However, we're going to go over some simple examples and hopefully make sure you guys understand. So as we can see right here, we have the absolute value of x plus 1 equals y. So let's start with some points and we'll start plotting them to see the whole graph. So at x equals 0, we'll have the y value of the absolute value of 0 plus 1, which will be the absolute value of 1, which will be also 1. So that's our first point. Now let's go on to x equals 1. So now we have 1 plus 1 equals 2, so the absolute value of 2 will be 2. So we have 2. And if we do 2 plus 1, it'll be 3. Absolute value of 3 is 3. Now 3 plus 1 is going to be the absolute value of 4, which is also 4. So as we can see, it continues to go up the graph in this straight line. Now, let's go on to the negative side. So now we have negative 1 plus 1 absolute value. So that will be 0. So the absolute value of 0 is 0. So we'll also plot that point. So the graph continues down. Now let's go on over to negative 2. So now we have negative 2 plus 1, which is going to be negative 1. So what's the absolute value of negative 1? That'll be 1. And then we'll do the same thing for negative 3, which will be negative 2, which the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. So we'll continue up the graph in the same way, same linear fashion, creating a V-like shape, as you can see. This further shows how absolute values are always positive, as you can see it from the V shape. Once it hits 0, it continues to go back up in the positive direction. Now let's figure out how to algebraically solve this equation. So let's say we want to find where the absolute value of x plus 1 equals 10. So now that we have that, the way you're able to solve this is by breaking it up into 2 separate equations. So because we know that in the absolute value bars, the positive and the negative are equal, we can set x plus 1 equal to positive 10 and x plus 1 equal to negative 10. This will be our answers to this equation. So here we have x equals, so then we just subtract 1 from each side and we get x equals 9. And on this one, we can also subtract 1 and we'll get x equals negative 11. So those are our 2 solutions to this one. Now let's do another example. So let's do the same equation, but we'll make it equal to 2 so we can see it on the graph. So we'll have same thing, we'll set it equal to positive and set it equal to negative, and we'll get x equals, we'll subtract 1 from each side and get x equals 1, and then we'll subtract 1 from each side and get x equals negative 3. So if we go back to the graph now, we can see that at x plus 1, or when x equals 1, which is right here, and x equals negative 3, which is right here, the y value will be 2, which, as we proved right here, is 2. So that's how you solve some absolute value equations. And let's move on to a few more examples. Now we're going to go over a few examples. This is a good time to pause, complete the problems yourself, and then come back to the video and we can work to the solutions together. So for question 1, we're going to do as we did before, and we're going to set what's in the absolute value equal to both positive 3 and equal to negative 3. We then can add 10 to each side and get x equals 13, and then do the same thing over here and get x equals 7. Those are our two solutions, x equals 13 and x equals 7. Now we're going to do the same thing for question number 2. We're going to set x plus 5 is equal to positive 22 and x plus 5 equal to negative 22. We then can subtract 5 from each side. We'll get x equals 17, and then we'll subtract 5 from each side again and get x equals 27. Those are our two solutions. Now for number 3, it's a little bit more tricky. You may think we would just set x plus 6 equal to negative 5 and x plus 6 equal to 5. However, remember, absolute values cannot equal negatives. This is not even possible. The answer to this problem is no solutions. An absolute value cannot. So absolute value cannot equal a negative. I would like to thank everybody for coming to watch the video. And as we wrap up here, I have a summary sheet for everybody. So here is something I like to do after I learn a new topic. And I like to write down the important notes, a couple examples, and some things I need to remember while I work on these problems. So right here is an example summary sheet that I created, and it's something you can use as a tool as you move on after this video. I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I hope you enjoy learning about absolute value.